Good evening, everyone. And welcome to a panel discussion, The Elephant in the Room, Whiteness. My name is Leslie King, and I'm a member of the advisory board for Many Voices, One Community, the Community Dialogue on Race and Racism. How many of you participated in the Community Dialogue on Race and Racism? Wow, quite a few of you. Just for those who are not aware of the background, briefly, the Community Dialogue started in 2007 as a result of an African-American man dying in the custody of white police officers. City leaders, as well as community leaders, came together and decided that we needed to have a conversation in our community about race and racism. And that conversation took place through what is called study circles. And in 2008, we had a community-wide dialogue where people in the community participated in small groups that came together and talked about race and racism and identified some ideas. And out of that, action groups met, and some of those action groups were able to follow through with some activities, and some of those activities and actions are still going on. One of our successes is the Beacon of Hope, which is now a nonprofit, and they're in the process of working with students in the schools to help them to go on to some type of higher education or vocational trade, and that was one of the top ideas that came out of those study circles. In addition to the study circles and action groups, we've had diversity of initiatives, we've had a summer film series, we've had fair housing workshops, we've held various conversations on the college campuses in the area, and we continue to facilitate issues of race and racism that occur from an individual as well as systemic perspective with our Racial Equity Support Committee as they deal with individuals who feel that they have been discriminated against based on their race. So tonight is just an extension of that conversation on race and racism. I'm just going to quote Justice Harry Blackmun, who says that in order to get beyond racism, we must first take account of race. There is no other way, and that's Justice Harry Blackmun. The dialogue on race and racism has not taken a colorblind approach to addressing race and racism. While we understand that we are connected in our humanness, race plays an integral role in our society, and it impacts many parts of our world. And in many of our conversations, we tend to focus on people of color, African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanic, Asian Americans, and so forth, and we neglect a real, honest conversation about whiteness and how the construction of whiteness impacts race and racial conversations and moving toward racial equity. Well, tonight, we are going on a journey with our panelists to have that conversation, and this will be one conversation of many. We've had opportunities to have private conversations about what whiteness means in the context of race, and so tonight we're going to have a public conversation about that. And as the moderators come up and as the panelists talk, you will have an opportunity to write down questions that you would like to ask the panelists. I hope that you all have been able to get an index card, and rather than waiting till the end of the night to give you 15 minutes for questions, we are going to collect those as the conversation continues to unfold, because we hope that there will be a lot of conversation around this. And without further ado, your wonderful moderators this evening will be Nina Salmon from Lynchburg College, Assistant Professor of English, and Virgil Moore, the Community Dialogue's Chair of the Community Education Committee, as well as he has his own business called Sustaining Peace. So if you would like to come up and introduce yourselves further. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know what to say. Again, my name is Virgil Moore. I'm a native of Kinston, North Carolina, and I attended North Carolina State University and I got a BS degree in zoology pre-med. I never did anything with zoology or pre-med. My career has been mainly in human services and working with families and children who have been in need. Moved here 7 years ago from Raleigh, North Carolina. I have a wife and 2 children who attend the Lynchburg public school system. I became a part of the community dialogue on race and racism as a facilitator. Then I worked in an action group, and I joined the committee, and now I'm currently the chairperson of the Community Education Committee. I also am the program director and co-owner of Sustaining Peace, which is a for-profit organization that teaches parenting skills and conflict resolution skills. We do mediation. We teach anger management as well. So that's enough about me. Introduce my other colleague, co-moderator.
Hi, I'm Nina Salmon. I teach English and some other things at Lynchburg College. I too came to Lynchburg from North Carolina by way of Charlotte, where I was a student in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg school system soon after integration, and was part of that experience and had a very positive experience as a white student being bused to integrate to the previously all-black West Charlotte High School. I attended Randolph-Macon Women's College and was in part sociology major. I was just speaking with one of our panelists about sociology at Randolph College. One of my former professors is in the room. I don't think we were actually in class together, but she was famous when I was a student at Randolph, Dr. Heath. And I have taught at Lynchburg College for 15 or 16 years. I'm not good at math, so somewhere in that vicinity. I am delighted to be part of this. I've participated in 2 study circles with the dialogue, and I think that the work that Leslie and the committee have done is just tremendous, and I'm proud of Lynchburg for taking this task on, and I think we are better because of it. I certainly have been pleased to be a part of this community and have raised 3 sons here and have a husband who teaches at EC Glass. When we are proud of Lynchburg and the community. So thank you all for being here, and we are going to introduce our panelists. I'm going to start with Karenne Wood to our right. Karenne is an enrolled member of the Monacan Indian Nation. She directs the Virginia Indian programs at the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities and is a PhD candidate and Ford Fellow in Anthropology at the University of Virginia, working to revitalize indigenous languages and cultural practices. She has worked at the National Museum of the American Indian as a researcher. Karenne held a 4-year gubernatorial appointment as the chair of the Virginia Council on Indians. She is the author of Markings on Earth, which won the North Carolina Native Authors Award for Poetry in 2000. She is the editor of the Virginia Indian Heritage Trail, now in its 3rd edition, and she recently contributed a chapter on Southeastern Indians for National Geographic's Indian Nations of North America.
I'll be introducing Ashley Thompson. Ashley Thompson is an assistant professor of sociology at Lynchburg College. She earned a bachelor's in sociology from the University of North Carolina in Asheville. Dr. Thompson earned her master's degree and doctorate in sociology from Vanderbilt University in 2007. Her central areas of research include the American South, race relations, and collective memory. She has a forthcoming publication in the journal Southern Cultures titled Race as Region, Region as Race, in which she examines how Black and white Southerners understand their regional identities. She has also co-authored an article with Larry J. Griffin, Social Class and Southern Identity, which will be published this year in the New Encyclopedia of Southern Culture, Volume 21, Social Class, by the University of North Carolina Press.
Paul Boothby has been a minister at the First Unitarian Church of Lynchburg since 2007. Born in Maine, he is a graduate of the College of the Atlantic with a BA in Human Ecology, and he holds an MDiv from Starr King School for the Ministry. He has participated in study circles on race and racism in Wilmington, Delaware, and Lynchburg, Virginia.
Charlene Greene. Charlene Greene has over 25 years of experience in education, working as a teacher in elementary and secondary schools and as assistant professor at Millersville University in Pennsylvania. She has been a trainer and consultant in multicultural education for the past 20 years. She has worked on diversity and cultural competency with numerous schools in Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, as well as with organizations such as the FBI, the U.S. Department of Education, and the Department of Public Instruction in North Carolina. She worked for 7 years as the Equity and Diversity Coordinator for the Albemarle County Public Schools in Virginia. Charlene is currently Program Coordinator for the Dialogue on Race and Racism dialogue on race for the city of Charlottesville.
And Julio Rodriguez earned his PhD in American Studies at Bowling Green State University. He teaches in the Department of Sociology at Randolph College. He has published and lectured on topics ranging from race, masculinity in baseball, the intersection of masculinity and foreign policy in film, gender and surfing, and racing and boxing. In the summers, he tirelessly but fruitlessly tries to break 80 on the golf course, quitting the game on a regular basis. The winter brings snowboarding and the to-date successful attempt to not break anything. Sports have always been central to his work and leisure. They instruct and inform his personal and professional search for a comprehensive understanding of the male gender. Thank you, panelists, for being with us tonight.
Give him a hand. Thank you. So how we're going to start this is I'm going to ask an initial question that all the panelists will answer. Then we'll go from there. And at any point where you have a question, please write it on the note card, and we have people that will take that from you and just raise it up, and they'll get it to us, and we can ask that question. Panelists, feel free to respond to any question after the initial question. Any one of you can respond to questions after that. And we'll go from there. We'll see how this conversation unfolds. That makes sense to everyone? Sounds good. All right, our first question is, tell us about your work around race and whiteness. And we'll start with,
Should I come there?
now I will actually bring the microphone to you.
Okay. The program that I direct at the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities is about expanding what people know about Virginia Indians in particular and indigenous people in general. And I think how that relates to whiteness is I'm very interested in the emergence of the ways that we categorize people through history. And I'm thinking that at the beginning, when Europeans first showed up on this continent, and this is a good day to be talking about it since we call it Columbus Day. You can't hear me? Is it on? It's on. Okay, maybe if I hold it closer, it's much better. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, so this being Columbus Day, we can think about the Europeans first arriving on this continent and bringing with them whole sets of assumptions that they already had in their minds. They weren't thinking of themselves as white people at that time because we didn't have those categories. They were thinking of themselves as Christian people and assuming that they had a certain level of civilization that was better than some of the civilizations that they encountered here, some of the civilizations that they encountered time periods like 1619 when the first Africans showed up on the shores of Virginia. So over a period of time, we can look at what the House of Burgesses did and the way that they began to legislate race, to create categories of people that they felt could be enslaved at birth and other categories of people that could not, and the ways that they came over time to privilege themselves through such policies as the doctrine of discovery, which allowed them to take possession of indigenous people's lands, and through other policies that regulated what people of color could and couldn't do up till the present day. And so we can look at science and say there's no biological basis for anything called race, and yet we all know that we have dealt with the effects of this construct for hundreds of years, and that people have been living and dying with and without privilege, which is what whiteness gives those of us who move in and out of that circle. It creates categories, lines between people, and yet we know that those lines are very fuzzy. So I'm just really interested in where we find the fuzz and how we begin to understand one another as real human beings who have the same sorts of desires. It seems to me that people have progressed a lot technologically, but we've learned very little about ourselves emotionally since the days before the Greeks. And maybe we ought to be having lots of these conversations.
Sorry, I'm not used to using a microphone. I guess I came to studying race when I've been reflecting on this lately, and I think it was a lot to do with my growing up. I grew up in North Carolina, and now my parents are, I would say, pretty progressive in terms of issues of race, but growing up, one side of my family is from Kentucky, the other side's from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And when I would go visit my extended family, I would routinely hear members of my extended family making racist comments, particularly about African Americans. And now, as more Latinos have come into areas of the South, now sort of transitioned to also comments about Latinos, and I think that just started sort of a conflict in my mind of trying to understand people who in other aspects of their lives were my, aunts and uncles and relatives who, were friendly, polite, ordinary folks, but then could have these very racist beliefs. So I think that's sort of what planted the seed of thinking about race, and then also the work I do is focused on race in the South. And then the issue of whiteness sort of came along as I started to think about Southerners. I was actually introduced to the idea of whiteness studies by my mentor in graduate school, Larry Griffin, and so it kind of went from there, thinking about whiteness itself. And then one of the things I've explored, as mentioned, is how white and black Southerners, traditionally when folks have said Southern, they actually mean white people. So saying things like Southerners are racist or Southerners lost the Civil War is implying that Southerners were white. But there's some increasing trends of African Americans moving back to the South and claiming a Southern identity, and there's survey data that actually shows that African Americans claim to be Southern at higher rates than whites, yet there's very little research about how African Americans experience Southern identity. And so I've sort of looked at that comparison in my work. Pass this along.
As was mentioned in the introduction, I grew up in the state of Maine, which is, as you may know, 97% white, I think. So I was just trying to remember the first time I actually met an African American. I think I was about 7 years old or so. But the idea of racial difference wasn't a real present thing in my mind until later in life. I mean, of course, we knew we were taught history and all and about difference in that context, but experiencing sort of firsthand the how that fell out in real life didn't really occur to me till I was just after high school, when I volunteered at a clinic, a free clinic down on Capitol Hill, run by the Community for Creative Nonviolence. And some friends of mine and I went down volunteering for the, 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock in the morning shift, when some gruesome things would come through the door in terms of the wounds and whatnot. But most of the time we sat around talking with the volunteers, and this was sort of my first introduction to the harsher realities of the separateness based on race and the fallout historically from that. But another piece of my consciousness around race evolved through my church, which the church, the Unitarian Universalist tradition, has been strong advocates for racial equality and civil rights for many generations, but we had this recurring problem of looking around in our congregations and saying, boy, we're awfully white in here. And why? And really asking the question, why? Is it something that is inherent in the way we run the institution? Is it something about the way our message of sort of universal siblinghood is packaged that is somehow exclusionary? Is it the cultural assumptions about the way we interact that feels exclusionary when folks of color enter in? My denomination went through a lot of soul searching around this and had a lot of hits and misses in terms of making attempts to try to address the race issue from an institutional point of view, that our identity as Unitarian Universalists, was there something that was inherent around that created an exclusive environment or exclusivist environment. And one of the interesting episodes was a program that, I don't know, there's so many different programs, and some of them actually were helpful and some of them were not helpful, like the one that called Journey Toward Wholeness, that began with a premise that all whites, by the basis of being white in America and the institutional systems in America being biased towards white privilege, therefore all whites are inherently racist, which, you know, is not a really good conversation starter if you want people to really look deep within themselves and think about, well, what is, you know, what does the reality of white privilege mean to you on a personal basis, or, you know, to me. But I think we've come a long way since then in terms of trying to ask the questions about how, I mean, there's the old cliche that people aren't born racist, they're taught. And so if we're all taught the cultural assumptions around differentness and class stratification based on race, or that I think one of the things you pick up when you're white is, or so I've read and I've been pondering it, I guess, that the cultural assumption is the system is set up in your favor. And so what do you do when you fail? How do you reconcile a system where so many millions of people of all ethnicities are out of work, are suffering, you know, white and black? It's like, and yet, and all that has to go into creating the mindset in the first place of believing in difference, ethnic difference based on race, and having to deny part of oneself. So I started, as was mentioned, I went through the community dialogue process similar to what we did here back in, I think it was about 1996 in Wilmington, Delaware, and that was very powerful. It was sort of an introduction to that whole open, more deep dialogue process, and I was very happy to be part of the process here, and glad to be part of this dialogue tonight.
Thank you. I guess my work around race began with trying to figure out who I was and how I defined what it meant to be black. When I was growing up, there were a lot of very implicit and many explicit messages about what it meant to be black. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, and in a matriarchal family, and so the images that I learned about folks who were different from myself were, like a lot of folks, through TV, through what I read in books. In my family, all of the women were domestics, and they were domestics in white homes. So they would come home and they would talk about the white families that they worked for. And so that started to shape my understanding of what it meant to be white and whiteness. And that involved, for me, a lot of excess. White folks were had a lot of money and were very focused on material things. And so there wasn't a lot of negative messages that that were explicit about what it meant to be white in my family. There were just things of I think trying to understand for your safety that because you happen to be black, there are places you shouldn't go. There are things you shouldn't say. There are ways that you should act when you are out and about. And there are things that you should expect when you are in school. And so that started to shape my notion of whiteness until I was able to attend one of my first sessions on anti-bias work. And then I started to have some aha moments about what it meant to be black for me. And not so much as the whole black community or the meaning of blackness. It was, what did being black mean for Charlene Greene? And as I started to become a little bit clear on that, and I'm still evolving in what I think my definition is, I don't think anyone gets touched by the multicultural wand and you're at the mountaintop and it's like, oh, I know, okay, you know, I can share everything I need to know with everybody else because I have all the answers. It's I think always situational, it's always evolving, and when I'm connected with, when there's an issue involving sexuality or religion or language, and how race or being black connects to that has an impact on how I start to, again, view my notion of what it means to be black. And it also, in trying to come up and constantly think about that definition for me, that's how I have shaped my definition of what it means to be white. The whole concept of whiteness for me is like looking at a black and white picture, and you define one aspect of the picture by what you don't see in another part of the picture. And so defining what it means to be white, or the concept of whiteness, is deeply connected to how I define what it means to be black, and the concept of blackness, or the concept of being Hispanic or Asian or multiracial or biracial. All of those ways in which we identify them ourselves are connected, but you also have to be able to step back and see, you know, where am I in this whole picture? And so, so I think I have to continually, as I do a lot of work around cultural competency, because what's important for me and how I do what I do around race and diversity issues is trying to figure out what are those skill sets we need in order to communicate with each other, in order to be respectful with each other. And how do we create those opportunities to come together and dialogue in a way that's going to allow folks to walk away from the table and say, okay, I learned something new about myself, not just the folks who were at the table, but about myself.
Thank you. As each one of my fellow panelists have shared how they came to whiteness, I'm jotting down more notes like, oh, that happened for me too, and that happened for me too, and rather than go through all of those and take up a whole bunch of time, I do have a seminal moment, and it occurred in graduate school when I was struggling to find a topic for my dissertation. I saw the documentary When We Were Kings. A lovely documentary about Muhammad Ali and George Foreman, Rumble in the Jungle, and I enjoyed it. It won an Academy Award, and yet after watching it, I was irritated. I was a little angry, and that's always a clue for me. Like if I'm irritated about something, I need to examine it. And I discovered the irritation was that this was a story about George Foreman and Muhammad Ali, but it was told by George Plimpton and Norman Mailer, and not to mention Leon Gast. You know, all three white, middle-aged, privileged men telling a story about, you know, two black men in the boxing ring, both of whom, at the time the film was being made, were perfectly capable of reflecting on the events in Kinshasa. And so I was a little taken aback, like, from a film studies perspective, this is a missed opportunity. And then also from sociological and a cultural perspective, this is problematic when we have white voices telling black stories. And that is what set me off on this journey. And I think like Ashley had mentioned, I have my dissertation chair, her dissertation chair, George Lipsitz, wrote a book called The Possessive Investment in Whiteness. And through her and through researching this film, I began to see whiteness as coin that people could use to get other things, as cultural capital. And then in investigating it further, I realized, much like Karenne has articulated, that there are folks who have not always had that coin who now do. So the Irish, Jews, Germans have not always been considered white and have not always had access to the coin of whiteness. And that has led to a course I teach at Randolph College called Assuming Whiteness, that looks at the history similarly to the way that Karenne does, but focuses on groups of people that we now identify as white who were not always identified so. And which brings me to a comment about something that Paul said when he said racists aren't born, they're made. I approached that course by saying that white people are not born, they're made. And so that's what's brought me here tonight.
Thank you all, and congratulations to the committee who assembled this impressive slate of panelists. We have a question already about clarifying one point. Karenne, a question comes from the floor asking how you would talk, or if you would talk more about the categories of race that you mentioned in your introduction, and do you see those categories as hierarchies or rankings? Oh, sorry.
Well, what I was talking about specifically is the way that the policy makers constructed these categories, and they're not the same categories that we use today. For instance, in 1924, Virginia passed the Racial Integrity Act, which applied to people of color and prohibited them from marrying people who were considered white at that time. But they put people of color into categories of race that included things like Malay. That was a race. I don't know what a Malay is. We don't talk about Malays today. There weren't white people and black people. What they did was they had one group considered white, and they had everybody else who they considered colored or people of color. But within that group, they had these different ways to break things out. They didn't have any category for a person of what we would say is Hispanic origin. So it shows us that these ideas are invented. There's nothing that's predetermined about those labels. And if you look even today at the United States Census, you can see over the decades how those labels have shifted, and how a person such as myself, for example, because I have a mixed race, might have been labeled Indian at one point, or Native American is a preferred term now, or mixed race, or it depends on how you check the box, and not all of us fit into one box. So I just think it's really interesting when you look over time at how people have labeled one another. And during this Racial Integrity Act period, this fellow, Walter Plecker, many of you have heard of, was the head of the Bureau of Vital Statistics, and he labeled people, and he labeled Indians as colored, but he didn't use a consistent labeling process. He would write notes on the back of their birth certificates saying, this person is an issue, this person is a mulatto, this person is a, whatever it was. It changed from time to time. He was in power for 40 years, and his preferred labels changed. So this is how we do each other, basically. And that's what is interesting me. When you bring it home, I've worked with Monacan people in the tribal setting for over 15 years. and seen how our elders were affected by those labels. And so, it's very much in the forefront of my mind what we call each other and how that determines the way we treat one another.
Thank you. Many of you may be familiar also with an article by Stephen Gould called The Geometer of Race that describes how racial categories were originally conceived by, of course, a white man. So that's an interesting side note. Thank you for your response. This next question is open for any of our panelists to respond to, and you all may choose to respond to one another once we start rolling. The question that I'll put before you next is the topic of this gathering.